This is lecture 9A for History 111. I talked last time about the Roman Republic and how Rome developed from this small city-state in Italy and founded in 509 BCE to, by the 1st century CE, this large empire that had territories all sorts of places on the Mediterranean. And then I talked about how in the last century of the Roman Republic's existence, it had intense class conflicts between plebeians and patricians over land control issues, and that ultimately this led to Julius Caesar trying to make himself an emperor and then being assassinated, and then a civil war, and then Octavian taking over and becoming Caesar Augustus, and essentially functioning as an emperor for 30-some years, but never taking that title. Well, after Augustus, Rome officially becomes an empire, and you see the Senate become weaker and weaker over time and have less and less to do. It becomes ceremonial, and the emperor basically takes over the Roman bureaucracy and becomes an absolute ruler, able to do whatever he wants. Now, the 1st century of the Roman Empire's existence, it actually expanded significantly. By 117, which is about the high point of the Roman Empire territorially, the Roman Empire now controlled the entire rim of the Mediterranean, including Egypt and pretty much all of North Africa, although there are a few spots they didn't really control. And then they had conquered all of modern-day France and up into some parts of Germany. They had conquered modern-day Romania and into the Balkans, and they had even gotten up into England and had conquered England. And so you can see on the map just how big a territory this is. And the Romans actually began to refer to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea, our ocean, our lake, because they surrounded it and they controlled it, right? And so this was the high point of the Roman Empire. Now I want to talk in this part of the lecture just about what that high point, that golden age of the Roman Empire, which is really the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, looked like. All right. So you have an emperor who is at the top of an enormous bureaucracy, and you have lots of territorial divisions, and you have provinces and districts, etc. And the empire is very sort of rationally organized and has a very clear a hierarchy of bureaucrats, etc. It's got a good tax collection system, but it's got a lot of other things too. And one of the things about the early Roman Empire is that it really is the success of the government depends on the personality and quality of the emperor himself. Because the emperor is such a huge part of the empire, has so much power, the personality of the emperor becomes really important. And I don't want to overstate it because there were some really bad emperors, and the Roman Empire survived that, and in fact just seemed to plow along without them because the bureaucracy knew what to do, but they could cause enormous amounts of damage. So let me talk about some of the emperors, both bad and good. The good ones, Marcus Aurelius, Trajan, and Hadrian, were all extremely adept at managing a large bureaucracy. They were good administrators. They understood how the process of how the government worked, and they made decisions that helped strengthen the Roman Empire in the long run. They also were good generals. They knew how to handle an army. They came up through as generals. Their early career was as generals. These guys, Marcus Aurelius, Trajan, and Hadrian, really are the ones who oversaw the biggest expansion of the Roman Empire, right? And so those guys were good, and they really helped build and strengthen the Roman Empire and help create the golden age that would come after them, because essentially, Marcus Aurelius, Trajan, and Hadrian are all fairly early in the 1st century and early 2nd century, and so they're the ones that really sort of build the golden age of the Roman Empire. But there were a lot of bad emperors mixed in there too. Caligula was almost certainly mentally ill, and he did all sorts of things. He had people murdered. He nominated his horse to the Senate. He had orgies. Rumors were that he was sleeping with his sister. He was almost certainly just mentally ill. Nero also was probably mentally ill. He was actually quite a competent emperor at first. He was quite a good emperor. But then something happened, and he started to mentally deteriorate and become very erratic and have people killed. And there was rumors that he burned down a portion of Rome because he wanted to build a racetrack. So Nero became erratic over time and died fairly young. And then there's Commodus, who's actually the son of Marcus Aurelius. And if you've seen the movie Gladiator, that's the emperor, Commodus. Now, the movie Gladiator is not really very historically accurate, especially in relation to Commodus, because I remember hearing a historian one time interviewed when Gladiator came out. The interviewer said, "Well, can you tell us what from the movie is accurate about the Roman Empire?" And the historian said, "There was an emperor, Commodus." But Commodus really was nuts. And in fact, the movie didn't even give full rein to just how nuts he was. For all that Joaquin Phoenix was kind of crazy, Commodus was even crazier. He thought he was Hercules, and he used to dress up in like lion skins and walk around Rome at night with a big club and beat people. If he met people, he'd beat them up with a club. And so the Praetorian Guard, his bodyguards, used to sort of run around the streets ahead of him trying to clear everybody out of the streets so he wouldn't kill anybody. Commodus was really erratic, potentially violent, and was just plain nuts. But for the most part, the damage these guys did was to the upper classes, because they killed people, members of the upper classes who they dealt with on a regular basis. But the empire as a whole sort of plugged along, right? And one of the things if you look overall at the empire, the empire did a whole bunch of things that really good. The Romans were great administrators, and the Romans were great as engineers. They built this fantastic road system all around the Roman Empire to basically allow them to move armies quickly from one place to another if there was an invasion. And some of those roads are so well built that they're still there today, right? And these roads were amazing engineering works. They were digging tunnels through mountains. They were going straight over mountain ranges. Roman cities were laid out on this beautiful plan. The Romans built lots of cities around the Mediterranean, and they had a sort of a cookie cutter plan they would drop in there with a grid pattern of streets and a central square that had a public bath and temple and government buildings, and they were really nicely laid out, and they were really beautiful cities. Rome managed water really well. They built a huge sewer system for the city of Rome. They built aqueducts for lots of cities, bringing in water from the mountains, bringing water hundreds of miles on aqueducts, these troughs, to the cities. And Roman culture had a lot of accomplishments. Roman architecture was fantastic. If you go to Rome, go see the Pantheon. It's a really cool building, and it's kind of amazing to realize it was built 2,000 years ago. And Roman statuary was fantastic. Roman philosophers wrote lots of interesting stuff on Stoicism and other things like that. Marcus Aurelius actually was not only emperor; he was a fairly renowned Stoic philosopher. Roman poetry with Ovid and others was really fantastic. And so Rome really had a lot of cultural achievements, but at the same time, Rome also had a whole lot of decadence. And one thing I want to mention is that in the Roman Empire, there's this fantastic class divide that in just about every region that Rome conquered, be it Greece or Italy or Spain or North Africa or whatever, Egypt, a significant portion of the population really didn't interact with the Romans much. They continued to speak their own language. They continued to practice their own religions, what have you. And they essentially had what we would call a local culture. Although they did have to submit to Roman laws and pay taxes and things like that. And later, the Romans did try to sort of push a cult of the emperor, which people had to sort of pay nominal attention to. But so for most people, the Roman Empire was simply, it was something laid over their culture. It didn't transform their culture. But there was also a Roman culture. There was a culture of the upper classes. And people in the upper classes of Rome, they dressed similarly, they read the same books, they got similar educations, they had a similar culture, they ate the same foods, etc., and they spoke Latin, good educated Latin. And so there was a culture stretching from Spain to Egypt and from Greece to North Africa. There was a culture of the upper class Romans, right? and in fact, if you look at, say, the emperors, lots of emperors came from places like Spain, which were sort of outposts of the empire, but they had the right culture because they were raised in upper class families. And so Rome had these massive disparities of wealth that created a sort of a two-level culture. There was the sort of Roman culture of the upper classes that was cosmopolitan and stretched all the way. Upper classes all over their empire had the same culture, and then there were the particular local cultures that the poorer people had. So there was a Coptic culture in Egypt, and there was a Greek culture in Greece, etc. And Roman culture, as much as it had some great things, fantastic philosophy and architecture and things like that, it also had a whole bunch of things that were really bad. Okay, so first of all, in the city of Rome had over 1 million people in it at the height of the Roman Empire. Over 1 million people, and over half of them were on the dole, which means that they were on what we would call welfare, and they were living in poverty in apartment buildings that were cramped together and had horrible ventilation and had a tendency to burn down and collapse. And they basically were getting basic food from handed out by the government, free bread and garum, which is a sort of a fermented fish sauce, and olive oil was the basis of their diet. Very few fresh fruits and vegetables, and the poverty in Rome was just sort of overwhelming. And so to distract people, that meant that the Roman population was kind of dangerous for the government because they could rise up, and there's a lot of them, and they're desperately poor. And so the government did all sorts of things. First of all, there was the dole. They handed out food to 500,000 people every day. But they also had gladiator games and chariot races and things like that. But you think about the gladiator games, there's something deeply wrong with that. They were having people fight to the death for your entertainment, and then they'd periodically bring out Christians and have them eaten by lions for your entertainment, right? And so this is a deeply sort of dysfunctional culture on some level. There were massive wealth disparities. There were extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people, and the two classes were just sort of living in different worlds. And some historians have estimated that Caesar Augustus, he basically personally owned Egypt. He might have been the wealthiest person in the history of the world, if you adjust for inflation and try to adjust for everything else. And yet there were, half the population of Rome was on what we would call welfare. You had religious persecutions. They persecuted Christianity. They periodically persecuted other religions. They outlawed Manichaeanism, and so there was a lot of sort of dysfunction in the Roman Empire, and there was a lot of what we would call social oppression that was kept down through just an oppressive state, meaning that there was a lot of people who were frustrated and angry, but they were just constantly suppressed by a powerful state. But the upper classes were really, in a lot of ways, very debauched. They used to have, build fantastic mansions and palaces for themselves, and they would be incredibly wasteful in terms of the clothing that they wore, and they had lots of slaves doing all sorts of idiotic things for them to show how fantastic they were. The wealthy were, and they would have fantastic feasts with, 30, 40 courses. And in fact, some Roman houses had a room called the vomitorium where, you would eat the first 5 courses of your meal and go to the vomitorium and throw up and come back and eat the next 5 courses of your meal and go throw up again and come back and eat the next 5 courses of your meal. And so, there's something wrong there. And they also had, orgies and there was the upper classes. Because they, had nothing to do with government and basically had enormous amounts of wealth, really, had very little break on bad behavior, right? So the Roman Empire was a real set of contrasts, and I'm talking about the Roman Empire because I'm a Europeanist. I know a lot about it, but you can say similar things about, say, Han China, or the Gupta Empire or something like that there were massive inequalities in wealth, and there were the upper classes were often fairly decadent. So anyway, this is the Roman Empire at its height. It's got these fantastic engineering works. It's got fantastic economic integration and growth. It's got beautiful cities it's building. It controls the entire Mediterranean. It's got a fantastic bureaucracy, really effective government, controlling territory. It's got some fantastic legions that are really well organized. It's got philosophy. It's got poetry. It's got beautiful architecture. But it's also got a whole lot of wealth disparities. It's got a whole lot of what we would call sort of cultural decadence, a whole lot of poverty, and a whole lot of suffering. So in the next part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about how this all starts to fall apart.